I worked at newspapers from the time I graduated from college in 1979, ancient history I know, until about 2003. The university that I attended, as part of their journalism program, required the students to write at least one story a week for the student newspaper, which meant if you started as a freshman, by the time you got out as a senior, you had probably 100 or so stories uh, to draw from that you could show potential employers. I didn't really have a career plan once I graduated, but I did show talent in writing, and I did show some talent in the visual arts. During my career, as you can see on the slide, I worked at weeklies, semi-weeklies, and dailies, and I want to go over each one of those quickly as it pertains to the writing and editing, because each one of them is different. Weeklies usually came out on a Wednesday, which meant that you started putting together that next edition on Wednesday afternoon, and you slowly built then to a crescendo on Monday and Tuesday nights to put the paper together on Tuesday night to be printed on Wednesdays. And the natural, I think, human tendency is after a big buildup and a surge, there was a tendency to back off a little bit. But what you really wanted to do was to keep that production curve as level as you could. But it's very, very difficult to do. On semi-weeklies, uh, it was one of the worst schedules I had worked on. Particular one that I was at published on Wednesdays and Fridays, which meant for the Wednesday paper you had this Friday afternoon, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and and Tuesdays to put out for the Wednesday paper. That meant the Friday paper you only had a day and a half turnaround to do. It was very, 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 very hard, very, very difficult to do. And of course, in addition to that, newspapers are a business. We would usually put out probably about 37 special editions a year as advertising vehicles for the company. Um, of course, they were advertising vehicles, but they wanted stories to accompany those. Again, very, very hard schedule to work with. Dailies, on the other hand, were by far the most organized because they had to be. Um, and I want to talk about how those came together in the dailies. I was fortunate to work at probably one of the last afternoon dailies, which meant that our staff meetings with reporters and editors started at 7:30. Sit around the big table. The reporters would tell the editors what was going to be coming in that day or what was planned. The editors would work with the reporters to see what those stories were, whether or not certain points were covered, if all the questions that needed to be answered were answered. And the photographers then would let us know what photos were coming in, either to accompany those stories or as feature articles. Uh, we broke, and reporters went to work on their stories, and each page had a separate deadline, uh, which meant that the reporters had different deadlines for different stories and different pages. Once those stories were turned in by the reporters, the copy editors looked at them, and it was more than just grammar and spell check and things like that. It was story structure, whether it needed a more dynamic or decent lead on it, and again whether or not all the questions that a reader would have were answered. And if not, the reporter went back and tried to, and most times very successfully, finesse that story the way it should be. Copy editor then, when done, turned that into the design editor who laid out the pages. And once that person was done, that person sent the page, if you will, back to a special camera at that time that took a picture of the page, turned into a negative. The negative was then put on a metal plate, burned the plate, the plate was put on a printing press, and everybody was happy. And once the presses started rolling, one of the editors was supposed to be back there looking at the paper as it came off the press, checking for mistakes and so on. If there was a mistake, the press was stopped, and the process had to go back to the reporter or the copy editor or the editor to correct it. The new page then had to be sent back to the camera again, and the plate had to be made and put on the press, and everybody was happy. Not always, because that just backed everybody up. The press people and the people who delivered the newspapers, circulation department, was never happy. And I just want to talk about one time. It's hard to believe that this got through three people, but maybe that lends itself to when you are editing. and you've edited something and you get to somebody else and they find something that you missed and you thought, how could I have missed that? Multiple pairs of eyes is always great on this type of material. But in this particular case, experience, it got through 3 people. There was an election occurring, a public election. I forget even now what the election was about, but when the headline was written, it was probably about 120 point type, fairly large. It came out a pubic election. And the presses had run probably 1,000 copies before somebody noticed that's not what we wanted to put out to the public. Presses were stopped, new plates had to be made, and even the delivery vehicles had to be called and brought back to the newspaper. And those editions destroyed, and of course new ones ran. It wasn't a very happy day at that particular newspaper. But that brings me to something else that I want to talk about, particularly since we're talking about my experience with newspapers. When we started out, and that was 1979, how we were trained at the university, it was highly discouraged. In fact, it was more than that. If you did it consistently, you were fired. We never put ourselves and our beliefs into the stories or how they were written, even in the headlines or anything like that. Again, we would be fired. And now when I look around and I see that, I don't understand how that came about. In fact, it was this bad. If you were on a newsroom and you dealt with public relations people, probably somebody like me now, they were part of the dark side. Tell you, there was a definite separation because we knew that they were people in the public relations, the public information had a definite point of view that they were going to put out. They weren't going to be looking at the other side. And so there was that separation. And now it just seems to be fairly common for people in the news business. I'm talking the national news media is prevalent. Uh, does that, and it's no problem. Anyway, it bothers me. In the next slide, there's some elements that, well, kind of graphic, but quite frankly, I don't know how else to do this. It had to do with an experience that occurred to one of the newspapers that I had worked at. And again, I should wish you folks were in front of me or me in front of you because I would love to field questions. Anyway, well, let's go ahead and talk about that next slide. Well, as I said, a little graphic. I'm sure you know this gentleman, Mr. Daniel Radcliffe, who I'm sure doesn't start out his mornings like this or having a tea. I assume it's tea and crumpets or tea and cookies or whatever that is. Uh, but there is a story behind this. And I used this photo because thank God I couldn't use the one that originally appeared involving my staff. Um, it's just one of the bizarre circumstances that happened to me. I look back on it now and I think, what in the world? Anyway, Mr. Radcliffe's got a hatchet in his head, which, obviously is his thing. Um, I don't know if they're still on the grocery counters now or not, but it used to be when you checked out. Yeah, I think there's still some there. You would have these weekly entertainment newspapers, like the Weekly World News and some other things, the National Enquirer, other ones that I don't remember. But as you would check out the groceries, you'd look over and there they were. So in this particular town I was working at, I was checking out the local grocery store and had my stuff ready for the clerk. And I looked up and there on the front cover, I believe it was the Weekly World News, was a picture of my city reporter with a hatchet in his head having dinner. And the headline was something like, "Man with hatchet in head leads normal everyday life." Well, it certainly took me aback because usually, and it's supposed to be, um, reporters and editors and newspapers are supposed to put out, or at least have a reputation for putting out factual news. Well, got back, went to the newspaper, and had a discussion with the reporter. I think we came to a mutual understanding. Uh, also, I found out from the photographer, staff photographer of the newspaper was also involved in it. They were paid like $500 for this, and publications, they still do, will contact photographers in an area and ask them if they'd be willing to shoot photos uh, for whatever story it might be. So they set this photo up, and again, there's my city reporter with the hatchet in his head. And of course, it was in the same town where we worked. Highly impressed upon them not to ever do anything like that again. In retrospect, I should have fired them on the spot. I did not, but I certainly should have. Anyway, it was just one of those things. I couldn't believe my eyes when I looked up, and there was my city reporter staring back at me with a hatchet in his hand. Well, I know that this particular video is getting a little bit long, but I wanted to end this section with something that, well, I just wanted to give you some very simple tools that I think you can use to improve anybody's writing. And most of you, or maybe all of you, are far beyond this type of thing. But when I look at the articles or papers by undergrads and graduate students and even faculty members, I come across some things that seem to pop up all the time that I believe that they would change their writing just a little bit. Makes all the difference in the world. And in this particular slide and on the next one, it's going to be talking about changing passive writing to active writing. It's a very simple thing to do, but after you start recognizing this, I think you're going to be amazed at how often you see them. I mean, this is pretty simple. At dinner, 6 shrimp were eaten by Harry. To make it active, well, you can read it. And the flat tire was changed by Sue. Well, Sue changed the flat tire. Very simple to do. And most of the time, by the way, you can do all of this in a much shorter or shorter number of words. I'm asked probably 3 or 4 times a year to talk to graduate students about how to write science for the lay public. And this, along with something that's going to be in the last video, are things that I think that they can do to immediately improve the writing. This is changing passive to active writing. The next one is going to be getting rid of lead-in phrases, because those commas act as speed bumps to the voice in someone's mind when they read. Anyway, on the next slide are going to be some examples that you too can change these passive sentences to active.